Thank you for having me, because I've been longing to come and speak to the SAT about Monasterboice, because I feel that, well, at least there'll be some people around here who will be interested in it, and indeed many of you, I'm sure, know the crosses only too well. I was very lucky because I was able to teach courses which involved the crosses, and every year I used to bring groups of students to Monasterboice, and you know, there's nothing like having a bunch of students who question you and ask and say, oh, are you sure you're right, you know, and things like this. So we had great chats sitting around about the crosses, and usually, well, not always, usually in reasonable weather. But I came to realize over the years that a lot of the way the crosses are presented and talked about perhaps doesn't really have all that much interest for a lot of the modern audience. And that was so because nearly everything you see when you go to the crosses, you get the lists of all the different panels and what they might represent, Adam and Eve, Moses and all the rest of it. And then you look at the students and their jaws are down a bit, and of course it's perfectly clear most of them are, well, lucky if they've heard of Moses, let alone anything about it. And so, you know, you began to think that these monuments are so impressive that you know, you need to kind of think of them in slightly different ways. And just a background there, of course, is Muiredach's cross. And one of the things that I was very keen to do was to try and create more of a picture of the sculptor, the man behind it. And I do really feel there is one major and very talented figure who was, if not responsible for everything, clearly was a master craftsman. And as we don't, I mean, he was anonymous. I mean, to us, he's anonymous. He wasn't anonymous then, I'm sure. So the thing I like to do is to give him a name, and obviously the sensible name, because, of course, the cross has got the inscription to Muiredach, to call him the Muiredach Master, and suddenly you start asking different questions about somebody if you can begin to think of them as an individual. So, and one other thing too, having done a lot of I mean, again, it's teaching, and my early studies in college were very much on European, on what you find in France and England and Italy and so on. And I just feel that sometimes people don't appreciate sufficiently in Ireland just what stupendous monuments these are in the context of Europe. Because at the time the crosses were made, and we're looking at Muiredach's cross there, but we could equally well be looking at the West Cross. At the time they were made, there really was very little on this scale, and certainly of this quality elsewhere in Europe. So they are monuments of really European significance. So the sort of questions I was interested in was, well, who was this man? Was he a local man? Did he come from this neighborhood? Where was he trained? How would he have got his skills at carving in the years around 900? Did he work alone, or was he part of a team? And where else might he have worked? Was he restricted to Monasterboice, or did he work elsewhere across Ireland or even further afield? And then the big question that I think is really interesting is, how did he do it? How did they actually go about making these crosses and indeed carving them? And this, I'm very fond of this slide, because here is typical party. Well, I'm not sure if they are typical, but you know, I've been there when you hear the guide explaining, now you see Adam and Eve, and going through each panel, and you can see, you look a bit more closely at the people, not in this case, this was a German party, but sometimes they're Japanese, sometimes they're Chinese, and you think, I'm not quite sure how much they know about Christian history and clearly they don't know anything. But one thing they could admire is the scale of this monument. And it's absolutely massive, and it's easy to take it for granted, and that's why I wanted people around. And if you think of it in terms, one thing I was taught to do when first studying the history of art was, when it's sculpture, you should always try and imagine what the block of stone looked like before the sculptor got to work, and then go back from there. And that's what I've tried to do here in a very crude way. But you can see, obviously, you know that Muiredach's cross consists basically of one enormous block, and then you have the base, and then you have the capstone at the top. But that main block, when it was extracted from the quarry, wherever the quarry was must have been about 4 meters high by over 2 meters wide, as you can see. And one thing to notice about Muiredach's cross is it's quite deep. It's quite thick, in other words. So we calculated it would weigh about 10 tons. And even just thinking about that and how that would have been dragged out of the quarry, you know, kind of makes you think. And it's a very beautiful stone, as you probably know, and a sandstone, but it's a curious sandstone because it's very tough, a certain amount of quartz in it. And for 30 years, I have been nagging colleagues in the geology department in Trinity, where do you think this stone came from? And there had been no serious research on it. People had come out with suggestions, but it's quite clear that in the neighbourhood of Monasterboice, there is no sandstone like that. All geologists seem to be absolutely agreed on that front. And I was pointed to CLAHS in County Meath there, North County Meath, by this man, George Sevastopoulos, who's a professor of geology in Trinity. And I could say one of the really valuable things about working in a university is you've got these experts on hand, you know, you can grab them over coffee or whatever, you know, harangue them. But George got really interested, and he said it's CLAHS. And CLAHS is actually an outcrop of sandstone, you know, quite some distance, basically 14 miles, I think, 20 odd kilometers. But here it is. It's now completely closed off, and you've got all sorts of terrible warning signs, do not enter, and all the rest of it. But, well, obviously we did, because here's the photograph. But if you look high up, I think you can see the kind of horizontal bands of the type of thing? Now, obviously, the beds from which the stone for crosses might have come would long since have been worked out, so you can only get so far. But the one thing we could do is take samples. But the problem is you can get your sample from the quarry, but not so easy to get a sample from the cross. And that's the problem, because you can't really compare like with like. But then, thanks to Helen Rowe, many of you will know Helen Rowe's wonderful little book on the Monasterboice crosses. She mentions that in several decades ago, 2 fragments of other crosses were found at Monasterboice. And so I wondered then, well, maybe we could take samples from them. And they're in the museum, well, they were in the National Museum. So I contacted the museum and said, you know, could we do this? And eventually they said, that's fine, yeah. They're happy to, well, they agreed to do it. And then they said, got a problem, we can't find them. And they had been in the basement, but eventually we tracked them down. They're in Dundalk, actually, in the County Museum in Dundalk. So here we are. I'm afraid it's a horrific story. You shouldn't really be seeing this, but we're taking, do you see the little sample that we took out from these 2 fragments? You can see where it comes from the top. So we took it from a broken edge, and while this still, I mean, and that was duly analysed and slices and so on made, but while it doesn't actually cut and dry prove it, it makes it sort of 95% certain that's where it's come from. Now, if that's where the quarry is, how they get it here? I mean, there's no obvious river transport. The Boyne isn't going to help very much. They've still got, I mean, Monasterboice is well above, as it were, sea level, quite a height. And, you know, nobody really knows, to put it bluntly, how they transported a block of that sort of weight. But throughout the Middle Ages, the standard way was ox carts, heavy ox carts. And of course, I think it's reasonable enough to suppose that. And we know we have plenty of documentation in early Ireland for carts. Now, on the crosses themselves, you get wheeled chariots. Now, they're a different sort of thing, but we do hear it in early Irish sources of a much bigger type of cart, wheeled cart. So that seems to be the most likely possibility. But elsewhere, if you can use water transport, that's of course what would have been used. Now I want to go back to the plan. I wanted that map, because there's CLAHS, there's Monasterboice. Now, if they're producing stone for Monasterboice, where else is that stone going? And almost certainly it's going to CLAHS, and it's going to Kieran. And the two great crosses, well, there's three actually there at Castle Kieran, just outside Kells. They're almost certainly, again, from the same quarry. Now, if the stone is being sent out from this quarry, in what form is it being sent out? Because you're going to cut it into a cross form, and so you're going to about halve the weight once you've cut it to shape. So it would make much more sense, therefore, if it was cut to shape at the quarry. And that, if you begin to think about this, it means the quarry almost becomes like a factory for producing cross shapes. And I don't think people would have asked, for a particular size block, for a particular, cross in mind. I think they would have just said, what's the biggest block you've got? How's the biggest block you can get out of the quarry, and what can we do with that? So I think the size of crosses was probably a bit arbitrary in that sense. And another thing I think that might have happened at the quarry here is we've got the famous cross, which many of you will know from Kells, the unfinished cross, where you can see it's partly sculpted, and then you've got blank panels, two, one at the top left and one at the bottom, and then just start here. It's been started, and it looks as though perhaps even at the quarry, it might have been roughed out to the extent that those panels would have been left there ready for sculpture. So you can see a lot of the work probably didn't take place at the site, at the monastery site. It wasn't the sole place that perhaps up to half the effort took place elsewhere. And one of the most interesting questions is this business of the ring, of course. And this technically is very tricky, because I doubt whether they pierced the ring before they brought it, because the rings would be very vulnerable and, for cracking off. So you imagine it might have been solid in form when transported. But the thing which had always intrigued me was that if you imagine your big block, I mean, remember it's like this table, but much, much bigger. And you draw the shape of the cross on the top, and you start hammering through or chiseling through to the other side. The danger is when you come out the other side, you may be in the wrong place, unless you're going exactly down vertically. And I'd often wonder how they, made sure that the cross, you went straight through at the right level. And in fact, they didn't always, because about 10 or 15 years ago, they had scaffolding up again, around Muiredach's cross. And I was really interested. Can you see, looking through the armpit, so to speak, do you see that roll? Do you see it takes a bend? I think they started from one side and then turned it over and went from the other and met in the middle. So if they didn't meet exactly, nobody would notice, unless you got to scaffold, of course, and had a glimpse along the side. So there's a lot more to making these things than perhaps we might think of. Anyway, I'd always been on the lookout for a catastrophe, and there's nothing like, you see, again, if you're teaching students, the one thing they do love is a disaster, and if you can find a disaster. Anyway, here is, again, it was George and one or two others who pointed me to this. This is on a hillside in County Wicklow, and it's a hill full of glacial erratics, of granite in this case. And can you see, you've got the cross, the long stem was going that way, and the long shaft has cracked, has broken. In fact, it isn't, you can't quite see this from this picture, but behind it you can still see the granite block from which it came, and they've carved about half the cross out of it, and then clearly it just broke. And it would be fantastic to get a bit of excavation done around that, because who knows, maybe some of the tools are underneath it, or maybe even one of the quarriers, for all we know. But it just underlines that there are dangers, and the danger of, even the cross breaking. One suspects there were many cases where things didn't work out quite as they planned. Now, we'll imagine we've got the cross at the site, and where does the sculptor actually begin in carving the individual scene? You can see this is the unfinished cross at Kells. They have these flat surfaces, these flat panels, and you might say, well, they're going to carve it. Why do they need to bring everything to a smooth surface like that? And I think that must indicate that they needed that to draw the subject on it, they needed a flat surface to, maybe they had, got some sort of drawing already, but it had to start with a relatively flat surface before they could, as it were, carve away. So I think it was all part of the process. There we are. And while we're on this, well, the tools, basically the medieval tools, very much as we'd see them today, that's a modern sculptor's kit, so to speak. And there is a 12th century carving from Maastricht, you see in Belgium. But it's a lovely carving because it shows the workmen, the operarii, and you can see, look at them with their mallets and their chisels. And really things weren't very different from what we would expect today. But one thing where the Irish sculptors needed help, and certainly needed something else, was in doing their interlace. Because if you look, and you can, this is a detail from Monasterboice, can you see where I've marked it there? When you're doing all these interlace patterns, the gaps in the middle, of course, are the crucial things. And if you look very closely, you often see they're rounded. And I don't think that's just the wear and, over the centuries. It's because they're using a drill. And there's the medieval drill. And it's what I call a bow drill. And I'm not going to try and explain it because it's one of these things. Try and put into words what you can see. But you see the idea. If you pull it, that's the whole day. If you whiz that up and down, it'll spin round. That's one illustrated, as you can see, from the early 16th century. The Romans had them, and they were clearly in use in Ireland. So that's the medieval version of the Black and Decker. Well, Black and Decker's a bit old hat now, I know, but and there is the sort of thing that they produced. Now, I'm showing this partly because I'm very proud of this picture, because it's on the north side of Muiredach's Cross, and there's only a few, well, probably a few weeks in the year when the sun catches this north side, and you have to hang around. It was between about 7:05 and 7:20. It was like that. So, but it does bring out the incredible labour. Now, one of the things that is often said and has been said, well, the great sculptor would have just done the figural scenes and done the fancy thing, and it would have left the, left this sort of thing, this pure decoration, to assistants. That, I think, is absolutely not true. That's a sort of modernist way of looking at it, as if decoration is an inferior sort of type of art, I suppose, but certainly didn't demand so much technical expertise. But my word, it did, because if you made any mistake on interlace and chopped off the wrong bit, it would really be, it looks terrible, and there are examples of that, but not happy to say it, Monasterboice. Anyway, now, one of the, I've talked about Muiredach's Cross, but the West Cross, I'm convinced, is by the same guy or, same group of people. But this goes one better, because, of course, instead of just the three main blocks, it's got a fourth. And you can see you've got the shaft is made of a separate piece of stone, and then the ring and the top, again, a different piece. And that was altogether easier in a way, because instead of the one huge block, they had to quarry one long, relatively narrow block and transport that, and then just the head on its own. But the problem then was how you fit them together. And that was done with mortise joints, and I've tried in this diagram to show you, many of you will know this, that the shaft fits into a slot in the base. That's simple enough. The problem here was high up, and you see you've got to drop the top bit. Well, we assume this because you don't know, because it's hidden inside, but it has a little tenon sticking at the bottom going into the slot, into the mortise there. And how do you do that? Well, the problem is that the whole cross is about 22 feet. So if you're going to have to lift the top up, probably you're going to need a crane of some sort, approximately 30 feet high, to get that and drop that vertically. There's no way you can shift it horizontally and kind of turn it upwards. And then you've got to ensure that it's, of course, an absolute perfect fit into the tenon. And even then, you can't help feeling that that's a weakness. And there are about 20 crosses across the country which were made with two pieces like this. And in almost every case, they've either fallen, or you can see clear signs that they've had to be remade and rebuilt. And that's the case here at the West Cross, and actually many of you will know that there's it looks to have been a bit sliced off the shaft. And I think what's happened at some stages, the top has fallen, not in the last 200 or 300 years, probably, maybe even in the Middle Ages, and they've had to remake the mortise. Because what happens, you see, here you can see how the sides of the mortise can easily break open. So that's a very ambitious type of cross, but really in terms of sculpture, in terms of actually structure, it really wasn't perhaps the wisest thing to do. This is the moving of one of the crosses at Clonmacnoise. You know how the crosses at Clonmacnoise are now all in the visitor centre. Well, this is the time in the 1990s when they were moving them. And that's the scaffold they had to produce. And this is a much smaller cross than any of the Monasterboice crosses. But it just gives you some idea of the scale of the operation that must have existed back in the, the early 10th century. And as for the crane, well, I took advice here on from colleagues. Again, there's a man in our engineering department who's mad keen on history of cranes, just the person I wanted. And anyway, the likelihood is that, and this was used through the Middle Ages, is this three-pronged hoist, as you can see it there, and that's still used. I couldn't believe it. About 10 years, well, I've given the date, 8 years ago, I walked out of my house and down the road, and what was there? I think this water, I'm not sure it's electricity, I think they were digging a hole for a water main, and there is the good of, I don't think they were Ushka Air and them, but anyway, whatever their predecessors were, using exactly the same treatment. But that seems to be the only way that perhaps they could have really erected them, but it's all a bit open. Anyway, so much for how you do it. Now I want to turn to the results and, in a way, the technique of what I would like to attribute to this one great master craftsman. And you see it so well on Muiredach's cross because it's well preserved, not least in these three wonderful panels. And it's the one at the bottom I just wanted to focus on it for a moment. This is the famous scene. Many people think it's the arrest of Christ, and you'd think it was the arrest of Christ because with the two soldiers coming either side with the sword, and there's Christ in the middle. But long ago it was shown that no, that couldn't be the case, or it's unlikely to be the case, because you can see Christ curiously has got one of those fantastic penannular brooches, which is not quite how you'd expect Christ to appear in the Garden of Gethsemane. And you've also noticed that Christ in the centre is holding what seems to be like a staff or a reed. And in fact, this is Christ after he'd been arrested and he'd been mocked as King of the Jews. So he's been shown as a king. And that's why, of course, he has the penannular brooch. And he was made to hold the reed as sort of like a staff of honour. So that's the subject. But what I want to point out really is the way it's sculpted, because first of all, notice the depth of relief. Those figures are really rounded. Just look at this, they're almost kind of standing, well, not completely detached from the background, but they're standing well forward. See how they walk almost comfortably along the edge. They're very nicely proportioned too. They have, they're quite chunky individuals, have kind of fulsome limbs, and there's a strong sense of movement about them too. See the two soldiers kind of move forward, and the heads I'd ask you to look at, particularly the head of Christ, that sort of quite rounded head with almost with some curly hair, and that's what we see with this guy over and over again. He also, of course, did the famous Adam and Eve panel, which many of you will know. Adam and Eve there under the tree, and of course Cain and Abel just to the right. But look at the naked Eve to our left and Adam with his beard to the right. And you can see again tiptoeing the same sort of very full rounded figures, well developed. a very recognizable and easily identifiable style. And the head types and lots of details of the figures come up over and over again. So it's very easy to identify this, this individual. And if we go on, that's our Muiredach Master. That's the detail, Adam and Eve, obviously. And, you know, they look very well fed. And there is, as I say, Eve to the left. And you can see the bearded Adam, as I was explaining. And obviously Eve with the apple in her hand. And walking. And then at much the same time, this is a detail from the Cross of Moon, and you couldn't have a different approach to sculpture. You know, this is the one, again, the students loved because they all knew the old Mr. Man from, you know, their youth. And these extraordinary little square figures, which all undoubtedly relate to metalwork because there are lovely metalwork parallels with the details of square millefiore decoration in them. But, you know, when I say it's easy to recognize our man's style, well, it is. And that's the same scene. This is the moon scene I was showing. The three Hebrews who, this goes back to the Old Testament in the book of Daniel, where they were meant to worship the king Nebuchadnezzar, and they refused to do it. And so they were flung into a fiery furnace, but protected by an angel. So we've got that in a kind of very brilliantly kind of simplified form, but you'd have to know the story to make any sense of it, of course. And then on the left, this is Monasterboice. This is the West Cross, and much more detail. Here you've got two soldiers either side, and you've got them piling on sticks onto a supposed fire. And then there's the angel in the middle with the wings, the angel, as it were, embracing the three Hebrews, who, of course, miraculously survived the fire. So two different versions, but it does bring out the naturalism and the ease and the movement, and indeed the skill of what I call the Muiredach Master. And if here's another contrast. This is the broken cross at CLAHS by, again, a very different sculptor, and again, I would argue an inferior sculptor. This is Adam and Eve, but just look at Adam on the right with his oversized head, and he looks a pretty gaunt, underfed individual compared to the wholesome figures we find on Muiredach's cross there to the left. So it's very easy to pick out this man's style. And can you see here, this is back showing the mocking of Christ and Christ's head, and I think there's a very similar head there on the figure to the left, sorry. But that's not at Monasterboice. That's at Clonmacnoise. And it's his style again. He's got the depth of the relief, the rounded, the sense of action you get. This must be, I think, a saint or overcoming presumably some unbeliever or demon, but it's fantastic. Look, do you see here this spear coming straight down into the eye of that poor individual lying down below? And I love that the velocity of it is such that his legs have shot up the side of the panel. And, you know, it's great stuff. And even that curve, this is a throne that I think the figure is on. It looks like an enthroned figure. It's difficult. Nobody really has worked out exactly what this or who this might be, but the general sense is clear. It's sort of overcoming unbelief. But the match in the style, if not the subject, shows that the same man is working here. It's the cross of the scriptures at Clonmacnoise. And we know this was finished in 909. And of course, we have a date for Muiredach too, because Muiredach and Monasterboice died in 924. So you have 909 at Clonmacnoise for the making of that cross, and a date before 924 for Monasterboice, Muiredach's cross. So, you know, it fits quite nicely into chronologically. So we've already got, I think, three crosses where this man was involved. So I think these are the places where I think our man worked. Kells, Durrow, Clonmacnoise, and possibly, I think quite probably at Duleek as well. So it's quite a range, but right across the Midlands, you know, very much in the what was the old kingdom of Briga, and then further to the west. And just to show one other thing, the common features don't just extend to his style. The subjects are often the same. And this one shows Christ in the tomb. Do you see Christ there bound up here with little crosses? This is Clonmacnoise. There's the actual grave. And there are two soldiers either side. And possibly the Mary is coming to worship. And there it is in the whole cross and then this is another version at Durrow. There are 4 of these versions, all by the same sculptor. And other features, again, you meet. This, again, I'm sure many of you have done this. You know how you stand under, at Muiredach's cross, you stand under the arm and you can look up and you see these extraordinary snakes, and they're winding round the little heads of presumably saints of some sort. And then on the north side of Muiredach's cross is that hand, that blessing hand. So if you stand there, you've got the hand of, well, God, presumably. But as ever, again, this was a favourite thing as a student. What hand is it? Which is it, the top of the hand, or is it the underside of the hand? And if you look, is it the right hand or is it the left hand? Is that not the fingernails? And is it not the wrong way round? Is it not looking as if it's actually holding up? And there's 1 or 2 quite learned articles and papers on the significance of the hand twisting around. I'm not quite sure of its significance myself. Anyway, so you see the 2 of them together. Not so much room at Clonmacnoise, but it's the same thing in principle. And the cat is fantastic, wound up there in the, and I have more to say about cats because this man liked cats. And here the 2 famous cats at the base of Monasterboice. And cats, of course, we think of them as pets, and of course, you probably all know the famous early Irish poem on Pangaborn about the cat, the scribe and the cat. But cats were a good mouser, a really good cat was worth a lot of money. And so cats, and that was because, of course, they kept down the vermin, the rats and the mice, and controlled your grain store. Anyway, I'm trying to build up a picture of this man. I also think he's got a good sense of humour, witticism, and again, that's themed on the right. That's the little scene from the base of Muiredach's cross, the 2 beard pullers, and lots of chat as to what this might mean. And there's one incredibly learned paper about all sorts of meaning this might have in a Christian cross, theological gymnastics trying to explain why such a thing should be on a cross. Whereas I'm afraid I take a bit of a cynical view of this. We've got beard pullers all over, got them in the book of Kells, look, there, and I see it more as a more whimsical thing. I don't believe it was all calculated to have some profound meaning within the Christian faith. And beards, of course, long beards come into view with some importance in 1185. Many of you may know this episode when Prince John came across from England and met a number of the Irish kings and committed what was the ultimate faux pas. He pulled their beards, which was not a sensible political move at the time. And so that's a bit of a digression from this, but the notion of pulling people's beards clearly was probably some sort of, I don't know, an insult, but other people would see it in completely different ways. Anyway, just to give a further idea of what I think is the imagination of this man, you can't beat the Last Judgment on Muiredach's cross. There it is, Christ judging in the centre, maybe David playing his harp there, another figure here playing the bagpipes, and then down below, this is the really key moment, this is the weighing of souls with Michael, you see, and the Michael there, and you've got a soul actually being weighed, but the devil or a demon is down the bottom here trying to hoik this side down. And it's an interesting point. Again, it's a very learned article I've read somewhere or other about, is it a good thing when you perhaps should need to know this, when you arrive at the Golden Gates and are being weighed, is it a good thing to be come down? Or because that suggests a weight of sin, or is it a good thing to go up to suggest? But clearly here, coming down would appear to be the good to be overweight on the scale. But notice our sculptor, he loves little local details. Do you see the ironmongery at the top there, and the way he's gone to so much care to actually put in the, to put in the actual detail. And then this is a fantastic subject. This is hell, of course. And you see their backs are all turned, so they're all being pushed to the right. But look at the way the demon, and with his spindly legs, is pushing them into hell. Brilliant, brilliant. And he's holding a book, which is actually a kind of book of the dead, listing all those who effectively are not going to make it. So he's a man, I think, of great imagination. And I come back to this question I mentioned at the beginning. Is he Irish, or has he come in from abroad? And almost certainly his work is embedded in Irish art and culture. No question about that. Little details you see. This is one detail. You see the spiral on the shoulder blade? Well, here you've got that sort of thing all over the Book of Kells in detailing of human figures. And then you see here this very extraordinary, this is the West Cross, you see this extraordinary arrangement of the robes there, which is echoed by one of the very famous early gospel books, the Sangal Gospels. I mean, it's very hard to make head or tail of what's happening with these stripped garments, but it's so there's really no doubt that he's not only aware of local ways of doing things, but he's aware of a great deal more than just sculpture. And then there are this is the same panel, of course, on the West Cross, and these rather strange figures. You see these two with an animal, in this case, again, an animal, you see its tail there, the other side. And this is particularly interesting because this is the crucifixion, so people went looking for, well, what happened just around the time of the crucifixion? Well, of course, you get the cock crowing 3 times. And so the figures, at least one of them, had been suggested, oh, this is the cock crowing. But as my students pointed out, it's got 4 legs, and so unlikely to be a cock. And it isn't that at all. And the person who actually had the truth, though it hasn't been recognized really in the way it should have been, was Helen Rowe, once again. And she realized that some of these subjects are not just describing events that happen in the Bible. They're actually drawing connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they're much more, as it were, profound than just a simple narrative reading. And she pointed out Isaiah's prophecy in the book of Isaiah, who foretold the coming of a Saviour, who would be wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her sheep dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. He openeth not his mouth. In other words, this is Isaiah's prophecy of the crucifixion, which is being depicted. And I'm sure she's absolutely right on that front. And the whole idea of the sheep either being not quite sure what's going on, being sheared, presumably, or possibly milked, actually comes out of Roman art. Here's a Roman sarcophagus of several hundred years earlier. So that's an interesting tale. But there are many panels, of course, that still completely mystify us. And if anybody could come up with a subject for those at the top 2 of the West Cross, these are the 2 sides. They're very worn, but nobody has really ever worked out what they might represent. So just to say a couple more words about the fact that I wanted to try and emphasize the extent to which this sculpture and the images that is shown has come out of the Irish church and has come out of the thinking and the studies and the sermons that might have been heard for at least 100 years, if not before. This is the poetry of otherwise almost unknown individual called Blomach, working about 750. And he has a poem on the sufferings of Christ. And they're just simple little verses in which he describes episodes. And I wanted to show you this one, which is, we're back to the mocking of Christ, remember, with Christ being shown as he, you know, as the King of the Jews, or as they claimed he was. And you see the poem says that a purple cloak was put about the king by the assembly in mockery that was put about him. The Son of God the Father, a reed was put in his hand at the end. It was said clearly to mock him that he was King of the Jews. That could almost be a description of the sculpture. And it's over 100 years before, 150 years before. So some of these images, and I think a great many of them, were already very familiar to Irish churchmen at the time. But the thing I really wanted to stress here, do you see a purple cloak? One suspects this sculpture was painted. It must have been painted. And so you could almost imagine, and at one point somebody did suggest this, that the poetry is describing this sculpture. Well, I don't think it can be because it's too early, but you can see that they're clearly linked in some ways, and it's the way our sculptor is drawing, exactly how we don't know, but is drawing on the past and drawing on the existing knowledge. One thing I haven't mentioned, and again I should do because Helen Rowe had an important part to play in all this, is where did this idea of the ring come from? And Helen Rowe was convinced that it must go back to Roman times, to early Christian times, in other words, because well, it goes back to Greece actually, the idea of a wreath, a floral wreath, was a sign of victory. You know, it was the victory prize, of course, in games and so on. And in the very early stages, wreaths were put round the Christian cross to indicate that it was Christ's victory over death. And Helen Rowe was convinced that's where the source of the Irish ring cross came from. But it was hard ever to make a direct connection and establish the link. And just about a year before she died, in the 80s, suddenly out of nowhere, well, not nowhere, it was Minneapolis, but it wasn't exactly where you were expected to find the clue, because they acquired an Egyptian textile of the 6th century AD, long before the Irish crosses. And it's like a prototype Irish cross. And you see the base, a big heavy base with a slot in it. And now we all thought, oh, is this true? Is this a real cross? What's he doing in Minneapolis? And they couldn't really say, one of those American museums who weren't terribly keen on explaining the provenance of the items they had in their collection. Anyway, that's probably a bit tougher. It seems to be accepted that it is ancient, but you can see the makings of the whole idea. So that circle started off, I think, as a wreath of victory. But by the time you get to Ireland, I think they've largely forgotten what that meaning was, if it had any significance at all. But what you notice here, this is the West Cross at Monasterboice. Do you see the bosses interlace, and then you go to the famous Derry na Flan pattern discovered, just over 40 years ago now. And of course, remember, the pattern is where the bread of the Mass is placed, the body of Christ is placed, and there, if you turn it upright, you've almost got an image of what you see on the cross with the body of the cross. And I don't think it can be a coincidence that, look, if that was painted, it's really echoing a pattern, and there's got to be a coincidence there. So, again, you see this interlocking of this man's work with the other arts so clearly. And so that really kind of brings me to a question now of who actually really paid for them and why were they made? Now, this is the plaque at Monasterboice, and it all looks very cheerful and merry, and there's all the local people standing around, and the notion which everybody has is the purpose of these crosses was to educate. And that's all very well. Maybe it would do on a decent day, a summer's day or whatever. But a lot of these panels are not straightforward descriptions. They're actually, you need to know the subject in advance, really, to make head or tail. And they're more reminders of perhaps beliefs. And they come in a very odd order often. And if you wanted to educate people about the basic truths of the Christian faith, you could do it in a very much simpler way. And I would sort of warn you too that in the throughout the history of Christian art, the one thing, I mean, great patrons who've built marvelous cathedrals, pay for great paintings and so on, they've always justified what they've done by saying, oh, it's to educate simple folk so they could understand the belief. It was the ultimate cop-out. It was the justification, basically, for spending in vast sums of money. And if they wanted to educate, of course, it could have been done easier. So I'm very skeptical about their role, really, in terms of education. I think it's much more important that they're really celebrating the status of the monastery, and in some cases the status of the individuals who made them. And you can see this because not only do you have Muiredach's name, of course, the abbot of Monasterboice, but here at Clonmacnoise you've actually got the name of the abbot Coleman, but also the High King, Finn. And the reason for that here at Clonmacnoise is this cross, as I was saying earlier, was put up about 909, along with the church actually behind. And so what you've got at the base here is the founding of the monastery. You've got, this is the king of the time, King Dermot, and you've got St. Kieran who founded it. So you've got a little foundation scene of the monastery. So what they're doing really is kind of enhancing the history and the significance of the monastery at Clonmacnoise. And this had great significance because back in 909, when the cross is being made, the then High King and the then abbot were rebuilding the monastery. So they're quite deliberately kind of echoing what had happened 300 odd years before, and that's the scene which appears to be shown there on the base. And when you begin to look at the base, and this is the same cross, what you get are chariots and you get warriors. And again, there have been attempts to suggest there's Christian meaning to these, but you can't help feeling that to every average person who walked up, they wouldn't see, I don't know, representations of Psalms or anything like that. They would just see it in their own terms of current life, power, the political power. And they're almost like statements of prestige. You've got warfare shown, of course, at Kells, on the base of the cross at Kells. So I've been quite keen to stress the fact that I think these crosses have much more to do with the prestige, the promotion of the individual monastic site and its patrons and its grander abbots. But for long, people have, they've tended to deny this. And this is one case here. This is Old Kilcullen, a broken cross, as you can see. Nothing like as splendid as the crosses that we have at Monasterboice. This is made of granite. But this figure, this sculpture is really very odd. You see a fellow at the left, but he's holding a crozier. Then up the top, there's a square box. Now, that's almost certainly meant to be a book. You can see a bell to the right, and then some poor figure lying below, bound up. And here he's got an axe. And there are all sorts of interesting claims made for this. And one of the official accounts said this may be Cain killing Abel, but hold on, that doesn't really fit that scene at all. Another one says it could be David killing Goliath. But Goliath doesn't look very big, and that can't be it. And the one thing that is absolutely standard across early Christian history of Ireland, I mean the monastic history of Ireland, is the way the founding abbot was recognised. The attributes, the things that accompanied an abbot were his crozier, that was the symbol of authority, a book, the gospel book, and a bell, because it was a bell, of course, that ensured regular observance throughout and made sure everybody kept to time and so on in the monastery. So this surely has to be a founding abbot, the founding abbot of Old Kilcullen or Kilcullen. Well, he's very interesting because we know the name of the founding abbot, but nobody seems to have noticed its significance. He was a follower of St. Patrick, and he was called MacTail. And what does the name Tail, T-A-I-L, mean in Irish? It means axe or adze. Axe, in other words, the founder was Mac the Axe, as I like to call him. And that's why he's got an axe. This is actually the founder of, and so that set me thinking, well, if you've got that at Old Kilcullen, could we find a saint maybe at Monasterboice? And up on the top of Muiredach's cross, there's this subject, which had, somebody suggested it could be St. Anthony, but for no apparent reason. But it's a great, it's one of our the Muiredach Master's great scenes. You've got a figure here, he must be ecclesiastic. Do you see he's got holding what is called a flabellum, basically a sort of fan, but you can just about see a cross on it. So he's holding a cross out in front of him. And then with his crozier, using his crozier as a weapon, he's standing and piercing what looks like a giant bird. And here is a figure falling backwards with a long spear and a beard. And you have to say, well, that normally you'd suspect that looks like a king or a major ruler of some sort. And so the temptation, certainly, you know, who could this be? It looks suspiciously, well, who could it be in the context of Monasterboice? What about the founding saint of Monasterboice, St. Bwyd? And is this not St. Bwyd overcoming? We don't have his life, unfortunately, or only fragments of it. We know nothing about his life. But it would be lovely to think that this is a miracle of St. Boyce or St. Bwyd, the founder of Monasterboice. And I think that would fit quite nicely. So to return to the sculpture, and just to finish up by pointing out that, and stressing once again, that these crosses are big projects and demanded a lot of money. I don't think they're just simple pious acts. They are real major statements, the equivalent of centuries later building a great cathedral. But what is really interesting is the networking. Here at Monasterboice, we have Muiredach, the abbot. Now, Muiredach was a double jobber. He also was deputy abbot at Armagh. The current abbot of Armagh was this man, Muiredach. And he was certainly a pluralist, because he was also abbot of CLAHS. They were sewing up the whole place between them, really, in terms of authority. And then Muiredach, we know, was also an advisor to King Flan's Synod. And of course, he was very much involved in the cross at Clonmacnoise. So these crosses, and this man, Muiredach, is working for a group of very high-level individuals across across central Ireland. And I think it's no surprise, once he'd done one of these great crosses, they all wanted a cut of the action. They wanted one along the same. You can quite see how he would then be in demand. So there's a lot of politics behind it all, and you know, these are political monuments as well as being, you know, as well as being religious ones. I'm not denying, of course, they aren't religious, but there's more to it than that. Is all I'm trying to say. So we might agree that the great crosses were erected for the glory of God, yes, but I think they also help to glorify particular monasteries, their abbots, their history, their status, and you know, and I suppose from what I'm trying to do is to bring in all this, is to try and bring the crosses down to a more human level. So they also, but by looking perhaps closely at what was achieved by this sculptor and his individuality, they help us to see that we've actually got a great artist, a great craftsman, an incredibly skilled craftsman, and a gifted craftsman, and one who I would like to think was a very entertaining and witty character, and of course, as we saw earlier, somebody who liked cats. So if you have been listening, thanks very much. That's it. Thank you.